fun to be back on this platform talking to you. Looking forward to talking to you, Augustine, about this. I've been in product management for a long time. I've been in product for about 20 years and have had a variety of different roles in product. The longest stint I did in the company was 10 years at Intuit, and at the end of that was leading customer experience development for the TurboTax line. So 5 years ago, we started our own product coaching practice, and in that we work with companies all over the world, helping them think about how to become customer-driven product managers. So glad to be here.
Awesome. And I'm Agustin Gonzalez. I'm actually on the solutions consulting team at UserTesting. So I partner with teams across product, across UX, and marketing as well to really help leverage the power of human insight to power all product and design decisions, and ultimately, help our partners make their organizations more customer-centric. But the star of the show here today is Vidya, and Vidya, I'm so excited to be chatting with you today and really dig into your wealth of insight. And as Laura mentioned, we last spoke back in May, and it's crazy. Here, a couple months later, it feels like a couple years at this point. But Vidya, curious to get your take on what's changed since then and how, in terms of product stakeholders and product teams, how they're operating, what their day-to-day is like.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? It's, I think a COVID day is like a normal week. It's like COVID years and dog years or something. It's hard to believe it's just been a few months, and it feels like much, much longer. But I remember back in May, and we're still reeling. I'm in California, so I'm going to liken it to like a wildfire. It kind of hit us, and it felt out of control. And so a lot of what we talked about back in May was, it felt like we were just throwing things left, right, and center and reacting. So much of it was, staying in home, working in teams remotely, trying to adjust to completely different needs, having your product roadmap being thrown out and having to pull features that you didn't even consider in because you thought there might be a demand. There was so much sort of throwing things at the problem. So now, a few months later, and the fire isn't out, it's still raging, but I feel like we've got a little bit more containment around it, right? We know a little bit more about the shape. As teams, as product teams, we're starting to see people starting to plan. And we've got about a quarter worth of data. We understand how some customers have reacted. We've tried some new things. We've had to make some changes, and I'm talking broadly, but every single team has reacted in some way and seen results. So the nice thing is that now we're sitting on at least some data. And so I start to see planning and strategy coming back. So some of the normal operating mechanisms that we're used to, that everything had been thrown out the window, we're starting to see some normality come back. And we're starting to say, okay, we still don't quite know where things are going. There's still a lot of uncertainty, but we need to start using data to start planning. And so from a product job, I feel a sense of, okay, we can take a breath and we can start seeing how to shape the future, which is actually quite comforting in a lot of ways, because it's a little bit of normalcy back.
That's awesome. And I think we can all use a little bit of normal back in our lives. So yeah, something that's interesting that we're seeing is, of course, here due to the pandemic, unfortunately, budgets are being slashed, some initiatives are being put on hold, and taking it up to a little bit of a higher level. Yeah. Why should executives care, now more than ever, about leveraging customer insights and, using those to help inform, product and design decisions, really now more than ever?
Yeah, that's so important. I think, we talked about the reaction, and I've been talking to product leaders over the last couple of months who felt like they just needed to make a call. We didn't have time, we didn't have data, we just needed to make a call. And a lot of product leaders actually didn't feel great about it, right? A lot of executives were saying, I remember a conversation I had with one leader who said, I'm not involving my team and it just feels really bad, but I've got to move. And so this idea of now that we are sitting on information, I think we have to look at customer insight, and we can get the strategy driven by people who've actually got some knowledge and experience, right? So it's no longer reactive. It's actually something that we can understand the disruption to the markets, to the industry, to customer lives by pulling in this information. And now that we can actually start thinking about strategy and starting to kind of put these roadmaps together, one of the biggest drivers of this, because we have such little, understanding of how things are going to go over the next 6 to 12 months, the only thing that I think is critical is that customer information, because that's a one piece of data that that's real, that customers reacting to. Everything else still feels like we're guessing.
Yeah, and going back to a theme you've touched on here in the early part of our conversation, having strategy and planning kind of come back in the mix, and things going back to normal a little bit. I guess, Vidya, what does a quote unquote modern PM look like now in the pandemic? Like, how, if at all, have responsibilities, objectives, the way they work, changed?
Yeah, there's a few things that have been coming to mind, and so I'll run through a couple of them. I'd love to kind of talk to you about what you're seeing as well. The first one, I think, this idea, this modern and maybe a COVID PM, is just personally, I'll start with that, is PMs always feel like they're working a lot, right? Product managers, there's a lot to do. There's roadmaps, there's working with engineering teams, there's communicating, there's talking to customer insight. And I think now with the staying at home, PM, the line between work and not working has really blurred. And so the modern PM I worry about the most is this, like, there's too much to do, and it's 24/7 opportunity to do the work. So I'd say the big watch out for the modern PM is, for leaders, is to watch out for that burnout, because there's been natural breakpoints and there's natural places in our normal pre-COVID lives. And we're starting to see that the last 4 months is going to take its toll, that all that reaction, all that having to be able to be on all the time, make decisions without a lot of data, and working with the teams all the time is a watch out. So that's the negative piece. I just wanted to get that out of the way. In terms of like how people are changing, I think the modern PM is like this idea of roadmaps. Usually they're visited once a year, maybe a few times a year for teams that do rolling roadmaps. That's no longer the case. This idea of planning and being able to change, I think the modern PM has to be ready to do this constantly changing roadmap. It's almost on a monthly or bi-monthly basis. They're having to really think about, like, what's changing, what are the inputs, how am I going to change this? So less prediction and much more agility around being able to kind of make those changes, use those insights to be able to think about the roadmap differently. So I think that's kind of quite a dramatic change in, like, having to set a plan and then having to be very agile in the way that you're responding to market forces and to what customers are doing and saying. So that's one. Another one, I think, is communication. So you're used to, as a product manager, having to communicate with lots of stakeholders, right? You're in the middle. Lots and lots of people in the organization need to have this information about your product, where it's going, why you're doing it, what the features are about. I think we're all in this Zoom fatigue, and in this place where the communication mechanism, there's only one. And it's overused. And so for a product manager, they need to over communicate, I think, in very different ways now. So rather than relying on a Zoom meeting with a PowerPoint, I think you need to think about, like, how do you get your message out in ways that people are going to pay attention, and you're going to have to get over this Zoom fatigue and get over this communication fatigue in order to really get the impact of your message heard. So I still like learning different ways that people are doing this, but the modern PM, the COVID PM, I think is challenged in the way that people aren't listening. We're just sort of really tired. Teams are just tired. Mm-hmm. And the third thing that I'll say, and then I want to hear what you're hearing as well, is making decisions much faster. So I think, again, from a traditional product management perspective, there's a way that you go about getting buy-in for your decisions. You have a certain way, and there's this company culture by which decisions get approved, get made. And now you're having to make decisions really fast. And so you have to figure out, like, who are the influencers in the organization? How do you kind of get streamlined decisions? How do you not get all the data and all the information and all the kind of pieces that you normally would have lined up when you're trying to react to customer feedback and you're trying to make a decision? You're much more hypothesis driven than you ever were before. And so we're trying to balance this way of having data, having insight, but not having the amount of time that you normally would have. And so how do you quickly create a hypothesis, make a decision, test fast, move faster? So all of this, I think, is around, part of it is, which is why I go back to the burnout piece that I said in the beginning. I worry because there's just so much, and there's so much pressure to move quickly and to react. Especially if your product or your industry or your company is not in the best place. I worry about that.
Mm-hmm.
That was a lot. So modern PM, I think a lot of things have changed.
It's crazy. Yeah, and Vidya, I think something that I'm feeling really summed up in this meme that I saw the other day, where it said something along the lines of, our CEO didn't drive digital disruption, our CFO didn't drive digital disruption, COVID-19 really drove our digital disruption. And it's from all facets, from both kind of externally and customer facing, but also internally as well. And PMs now, I'm hearing, have to do a lot more with less. Maybe the research resources that they used to have before the pandemic have been furloughed or, put on hold and, transferred to other initiatives as well. And that's definitely something I want to ask you about in a few minutes. But going back to something you just mentioned, really resonated with me. It's the aspect of now how PMs should be over communicative and more collaborative, and also wary of, burning out in this completely, digital world. And you recently had a blog post, which was 10 tips to move strategy sessions online. I thought that was awesome, really provided super helpful tactics to plan focused and effective strategy sessions when everyone is online or virtual, and, weaving some things in there to help avoid burnout as well. Can you, enlighten our audience on some key takeaways from that post? And I guess also, too, how can we use customer insights to also make those sessions more impactful?
Yeah, totally, absolutely. So part of this was based on learning the hard way. We had some clients that, we had some strategy sessions scheduled, and suddenly we couldn't do them anymore in person. And I think so many times, and I'm sure we've all been in this position, you go to a strategy session and so much of it is like you rely on just that interpersonal. You can sit there and you can watch PowerPoints, you can sit there and listen to data, and then you can get up, you can stretch, you can have that conversation. Trying to move all of that online, we just learned, and that's where the 10 tips came from. So I just wanted to maybe just kind of talk about a couple of them, which I think are really useful from the product perspective. And one of them goes to that communication piece that we just talked about, and that is really set your pre-reading. Really think about what is it that you want people to understand about the changes in the market, the changes in the industry, and the changes in customer. What have you learned about behavior, and how is that influencing what you're doing going forward? And this idea of pre-reading and having people come in ready to have a conversation means that you can have a PowerPoint-free zone. Instead of like it's us talking about what we learned. And so that piece of pre-reading, I think, has been so critical in setting up a great session. And added to that is having people write down their assumptions. I think, again, we've been in strategy sessions that kind of devolve into opinion conversations. So it's I think this and I think that. And we really wanted to make these smaller sessions much more effective. So we said, do this reading and then come out with 2 or 3 assumptions based on what you've read. And it can be linked to data. It can be linked to something that you've read about the market and the competitor. And ideally for product managers, it's linked to something that you've learned from a customer. And so that might be a conversation, it might be a session that you watched them using your product and learning about the different kinds of questions they might be asking. But that assumption and writing down that assumption before you go into the session allows us to get to a hypothesis-based discussion. So we can either disprove that assumption by saying, okay, here are the facts and here's what we've learned, or we can say we actually don't know that. And it's a great way to have a specific action come out to go learn about it. So those two pieces hand in hand. And I know that we talked about it for strategy sessions, but we found it's working just as effectively for any meeting that you're doing online. Like, just do the pre-work, write it down, get people to come in with at least 2 or 3 items, facts, questions, assumptions written down based on what they've read, and then talk just about that. And of course, you can start with, summarizing the main points, the big issues, the big driving factors, but just don't kind of go into that place where you're presenting information, because we found it just doesn't work. And it's actually kind of just really painful as well.
Yeah, Vidya, we were even talking in our virtual backstage here before our session on the PowerPoint fatigue, that it's so real. It's so real. And I love what you just talked about with the pre-reading, thinking about how that can just make, really any meeting, but also strategy sessions, just that much more collaborative and productive. And I mean, that even you mentioning that just popped into my mind, visions of like ancient Greece and Socrates, where they were all getting together and they didn't have PowerPoints. They all just had a healthy debate and, different points of view, and that led to outcomes. So that was fantastic. And thank you for that. And that kind of, you mentioned, using customer insights in those strategy sessions as well to either, prove or disprove hypotheses. Something we're hearing a lot more of nowadays is that product teams have to do more with less. And they don't have as many resources, unfortunately, in a lot of cases, as they might have had before the pandemic. So I think you have a term here. I think you call it Scrappy research. But can you share with our audience on how product teams and product managers can really do more with less nowadays?
Yeah, I would. It's funny because the Scrappy research term, we've been using that as part of our product coaching, because being a customer-driven product manager means that you got to learn from customers, and many teams don't have the resources for a big research department, or they don't have a ton of money to put into customer research. And so what we're saying is, even if you do, I mean, it's great if you have those resources at hand, but even if you do, you as a product manager should still be learning directly. And the reason we call it Scrappy research is that we want you to spend no more than an hour putting the plan together, putting your questions together, and it's all based around a specific hypothesis. So the idea of being able to quickly, out of these discussions, outline, here are the things that we don't know, and go after those things that are scary, those things that are really going to impact your business if you're wrong, or are going to have amazing positive results if you're right. Both of those extremes are where we love focusing for Scrappy research, because they both have such important impact on your business. And so the idea of going to Scrappy research is just figure out how you quickly get to a customer and you quickly learn. And I love tools like UserTesting, of course, where you can just hear how customers are thinking about your product or an idea or anything that is remotely associated with it. And there's one tip that I wanted to share that I learned recently. We're so used to thinking about competition and we're looking at market forces, and teams, I think, now have an opportunity to learn from those companies that are thriving in the last 4 months, because there's a group of companies that are doing extremely well, and there's a group of companies that have pivoted their products or their services, and they're actually meeting new unmet needs of customers. And so I would say go do research on those. It always doesn't have to be Scrappy research on your own product or your own feature set. You can learn so much by asking, with your lens of what you are good at and what you are strong in, go learn about some of those companies that are doing extremely well. And I think that's the kind of ideas, and bringing it back to the conversation we started with, Augustine, which is around strategy and around companies that they're now starting to have time to learn and time to think about the future. It's time to also be inspired and get interesting learning from other places. So I think research, customer insight is so critical. Just think about going a little bit outside of your immediate circle to go learn elsewhere as well.
That's awesome. And Vidya, now you have me intrigued. And if anyone else has any questions, definitely a reminder to feel free to put them in the chat. But Vidya, what are some of those companies that you mentioned have done a really, really good job of adjusting to the times and pivoting that our audience can go and look up to maybe emulate?
Yeah, I think when I think about companies like DocuSign, I think is a great one. You would think that because primarily real estate has slowed, that would be an assumption I would have had going into a session. I would say no one's going out, staying in place, real estate's down. It's actually not true. I have a friend who got an offer like over her asking price just this weekend, and there's so much demand. People are moving out of centers. They're moving out of the places they normally would live. It's a trend that we're starting to slowly see. We don't have a ton of data yet, but there's a company that has done a really good job. It's a really simple job, and they understand how to meet a specific need really well. So there's an organization where I might go learn about an assumption that I had about a trend. Go learn about people moving. Why are they moving? What are they looking for? What's the process by which they went through and they signed documents now that this is all virtual? So that's an interesting one. Another one might be, I'm looking at gyms, and in the beginning, like when all the gyms shut down, we had horrible Zoom videos of people trying to sort of share classes. Well, they're doing some really interesting things now. There's much higher quality, but they're also doing things like equipment rental. And so they've switched their business model to consider, how am I going to keep working through this? So I would say look for those types of industries and look for those companies, things that you use, things in the last 3 months that you feel are indispensable or you've increased the use of. Look to your own life, look to your own experience, and then go look for those companies that you believe are making an important difference, and go learn about them. I think those are great ways for us to be inspired, because we need new input, because the way that we've traditionally thought about our product and has worked is not necessarily the way it's going to work in the future. And so much of this out of the box, being influenced, having a different way to think about it, I think is going to really help us as we shape our products for the future.
That's fascinating. And I think it was Charles Darwin that once said, survival of the fittest. And it seems like, the companies that are going to thrive and come out even more primed for success during this pandemic, but also after, are the ones that can really think out of the box and come up with those, kind of off the wall creative solutions, like, the gym example, when now they're renting out equipment, when, something that you don't necessarily think about fitting into a traditional business model before the pandemic, but a great example of, pivoting and changing strategy. And so Vidya, one thing that you covered back in the May webinar that I think is worth revisiting, and you touched on this a little bit earlier on in our discussion, but how can PMs stay on top of ever-changing expectations, roadmap, strategy, when things are still, a few months into this pandemic, still changing a mile a minute?
I think that it's such a critical part of the job to stay on top of this. I just go back to find a way to talk to your customers every week. Get a small group. If you don't have a customer advisory group, it's not difficult to pull one together. And people always want to talk to you. Like, you will find, even now, customers want to talk to you. Prospects will talk to you. It's loosening up. In the beginning, when we talked back in May, it was really hard to get to, I think, higher level executives and decision makers. because they were so focused. And if you were a CFO or a CMO, it was really difficult to get to that level. That's starting to loosen up as well. But even so, you can get proxies just as long as you're not making decisions in your own little bubble. So I'd say put together, as part of Scrappy research, put together a small group of customers that you talk to regularly, and then find a list of those questions that are really important. And if you can target and you can ask people for free, even, so many customers will talk to you for like nothing, but then use tools, like the wonderful one that you have, to go learn regularly, because that rhythm, I think, is so important. It's time. It's like the panic is over, the fire is contained. It's time to put that operating mechanism back into place and have that regular learning always feeding your decisions. So that's the one thing we've always gone back to. And we tried back in May to say, don't lose it, keep going, find a way to talk. Now that things are starting to return to a steady, somewhat of a steady state, a contained state, I think it's back. It's really important to put that operating mechanism back in place.
Awesome. That's fantastic. And a couple minutes left, Vidya. Any parting thoughts for our audience, and anything else you want to impart?
So I go back to the tenets of what we teach every time, our coaching and product management, and it's really based on three things. And so I would say, as you think about strategy and you think about the future, get really clear on the problem that you want to solve. Like, get clear on the customer problem and make sure it really is a problem and not something that you want to be a problem. Be really clear on who the customer is. Just super, especially now psychographically, I think people's attitudes and behaviors are changing so much. Just get a really good sense of who that person is. And the third one is that Scrappy research. Go learn. Don't do anything without learning from customers, and test a hypothesis about a problem. Test that hypothesis about your customer, and then make sure that you've got customers to talk through every step of the way. That's my parting advice.
Oh, that's awesome. Vidya, thank you so much. Vidya Dinamani, founder at Product Rebel. Check her out, doing a lot of really awesome stuff. And thank you to everyone for tuning in as well. And thank you, Vidya.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care.